Have you ever felt that your vote doesn't really matter? That regardless of which lever you pull in that voting booth, the outcome was predetermined long before you entered? You're not paranoid. You're not conspiracy-minded. You're simply beginning to see the architecture of power that exists behind the theater of democracy. Welcome to Eyes of Power. Today we're going to explore how presidents and world leaders aren't selected in voting booths, but rather in boardrooms and exclusive clubs decades before they ever appear on your ballot. This isn't about election fraud or vote counting. It's something far more sophisticated, far more elegant, and far more disturbing. Consider for a moment how presidents emerge seemingly from nowhere. Unknown senators, governors, or business people who suddenly receive unprecedented media coverage, funding, and institutional support. Their rise appears meteoric, but what you're witnessing is merely the public unveiling of a candidate who has been carefully vetted, groomed, and positioned for years, sometimes decades, before you ever learn their name. The pathway to presidential power is not a spontaneous journey of merit. It's a carefully orchestrated process of selection, cultivation, and deployment. This is not speculation. This is how power actually works in our world. The question isn't whether this happens, but rather how it happens, who makes these selections, and what criteria they use to choose the individuals who will ostensibly lead the free world. To understand this system, we need to examine three interlocking mechanisms: the talent identification networks, the grooming process, and the controlled introduction to public life. The talent scouts of global power don't look for charisma or integrity. They look for the perfect combination of usefulness and controllability. And they start looking very early. The first stage begins at elite universities and institutions: Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, Sciences, Po, the Sorbonne. These aren't simply educational institutions. They are the initial filtering mechanisms where future leaders are first identified. But contrary to popular belief, academic excellence is rarely the primary quality being assessed. Instead, scouts look for individuals who possess a specific psychological profile, intelligent enough to execute complex tasks, charismatic enough to sell policies to the public, yet malleable enough to be directed. Above all, they seek individuals with exploitable weaknesses, whether financial troubles, sexual indiscretions, or hidden addictions, that can serve as leverage points throughout their career. Take Bill Clinton, identified at Georgetown, then Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar long before becoming governor of a small state, or Barack Obama, whose rise from community organizer to president in such a compressed time frame defies conventional political trajectory. George W. Bush, whose academic record would normally disqualify someone from high office, yet whose family connections placed him in the pipeline decades before his presidency. Emmanuel Macron, an investment banker who had never held elected office, suddenly funded and promoted to the presidency of France. These aren't coincidences. They are evidence of the selection process at work. The second mechanism is what we might call the testing ground. Once identified, potential leaders are placed in positions of increasing visibility and responsibility, but always in controlled environments: a seat on a corporate board, a role at a prominent foundation, a governorship or Senate seat. These positions serve dual purposes. They build the necessary resume for public consumption, while allowing the actual power brokers to assess how well the candidate follows direction, handles pressure, and maintains discretion. This period of testing typically lasts 10 to 15 years. During this time, the candidate is introduced to the networks that actually govern global affairs, not the governments you vote for, but the interconnected web of financial institutions, multinational corporations, think tanks, and private clubs where real policy is formulated. Organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, and the World Economic Forum aren't merely discussion forums. They are the venues where future leaders are presented to the current architects of global power. Consider how many presidents and prime ministers attended Bilderberg meetings in the years before their election. Bill Clinton in 1991, Tony Blair in 1993, Emmanuel Macron in 2014, all shortly before their rise to power. This isn't coincidental. These forums serve as audition spaces where candidates demonstrate their willingness to advance certain agendas regardless of public opinion or national interest. Those who perform well receive the ultimate prize, the full support of the global power network when they make their bid for high office. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this system is the controlled introduction to public life, what marketing experts would recognize as product launch, because that's what a presidential candidate ultimately is, a product being sold to voters, packaged with carefully crafted narratives, with all defects hidden and selling points emphasized. The media plays a critical role in this process, not through explicit conspiracy, but through the economic incentives that govern news organizations dependent on access to power. Examine how certain candidates receive disproportionate coverage, how their backgrounds are carefully framed, how their weaknesses are minimized while their strengths are amplified. This isn't random. It's the result of coordinated media campaigns orchestrated by the same networks that selected the candidate years earlier. When multiple major news outlets suddenly begin featuring the same previously unknown figure, presenting identical narratives about their biography and qualifications, you're witnessing the product launch phase of presidential selection. The timing of these launches is carefully calculated, typically 4 to 6 years before the intended presidency. This provides sufficient time to build name recognition and positive associations, while not so much time that the candidate becomes stale or accumulates too many political liabilities. It's a delicate balance, managed by teams of strategists who understand that public perception can be engineered with scientific precision. But perhaps you're skeptical. Perhaps you believe that while influence exists, the system still fundamentally honors democratic choice. Consider then the remarkable consistency of policy across administrations that supposedly represent opposed political philosophies. Despite the theatrical antagonism between parties, core policies regarding central banking, military spending, surveillance, and corporate regulation remain strikingly consistent regardless of who occupies the White House. This consistency cannot be explained by democratic preference. Polls consistently show that voters across the political spectrum oppose many of these policies. The continuity exists because the selection process ensures that only candidates who will maintain these policies ever reach the ballot. Let's examine some specific cases that illuminate this pattern. In 1991, a relatively unknown governor from Arkansas named Bill Clinton attended the Bilderberg meeting. Within months, he announced his candidacy for president. Despite scandals that would have ended most political careers, he received unprecedented media support and financial backing. The pattern repeated with Barack Obama, who gave a single, well-received speech at the 2004 Democratic Convention and was almost immediately discussed as presidential material, despite having minimal experience. By 2006, he was meeting with key financial leaders at the Council on Foreign Relations. 2 years later, he was president. Donald Trump presents an interesting case study, initially portrayed as an outlier to this system. Yet a closer examination reveals that his 2016 campaign received an estimated $5 billion in free media coverage, far exceeding that of his rivals. Whether intentionally or not, media organizations made Trump the centerpiece of the election cycle. And while his style differed dramatically from his predecessors, the core policies regarding military spending, intelligence agencies, and financial systems remained largely unchanged. The theatrical aspects of politics shifted dramatically, while the underlying power structures continued uninterrupted. This pattern isn't limited to the United States. Emmanuel Macron worked at the Rothschild Investment Bank with no political experience. then was suddenly elevated to Minister of Economy in 2014. By 2016, he had his own political movement, despite never having held elected office. In 2017, he was President of France. His meteoric rise mirrors the pattern we've observed consistently: identification, grooming, introduction, and elevation, all occurring years before the public ever casts a vote. Boris Johnson, though presenting himself as a populist outsider, was in fact a product of the most elite British institutions, Eton and Oxford, and had been moving through the pipeline of power for decades before becoming Prime Minister. Justin Trudeau, leveraging his father's name but otherwise lacking significant qualifications, was similarly fast-tracked to leadership. The consistency of this pattern across diverse political systems suggests not coincidence, but methodology. The 20-year pipeline from identification to presidency is not an arbitrary time frame, but rather the optimal period for transforming a promising candidate into a reliable instrument of power. The first decade involves education, initial testing, and integration into the networks of influence. The second decade involves higher-profile positions, media introduction, and finally, the campaign itself. What's particularly interesting is how this system has adapted to maintain itself, even as information becomes more widely available. The architects of power have learned that the appearance of outsider status is now valuable. Thus, candidates are increasingly packaged as anti-establishment, while being products of the very establishment they critique. This creates the illusion of choice and change while ensuring fundamental continuity. But what criteria do these power networks use to select their candidates? Contrary to popular imagination, ideology is rarely the determining factor. Instead, the selection is based on a combination of psychological traits, social connections, and most importantly, reliability. The ideal candidate is intelligent enough to understand complex issues, but not independent enough to challenge the frameworks within which those issues are presented. They must be ambitious enough to desire power, but insecure enough to follow direction to maintain it. Above all, they must demonstrate loyalty to the interests that elevated them, not necessarily through explicit agreements, but through an intuitive understanding of which boundaries cannot be crossed. This system works precisely because it is not a conspiracy in the conventional sense. There are no secret meetings where the next 3 presidents are explicitly named, though gatherings like Bilderberg come close. Rather, it functions as an ecosystem of aligned interests: financial institutions seeking favorable regulation, defense contractors seeking military commitments, technology companies seeking favorable treatment, all converging around candidates who signal receptivity to these priorities. The most effective aspect of this system is its deniability. Anyone attempting to describe it can easily be dismissed as promoting conspiracy theories, despite the observable patterns and obvious power dynamics at play. The genius of modern power is that it hides in plain sight, visible to anyone who looks beyond the political theater, yet easily deniable because its mechanisms are complex and distributed rather than centralized and explicit. So where does this leave you, the voter? Understanding this system doesn't mean abandoning participation. It means participating with open eyes. The vote you cast still matters, but perhaps not in the way you've been led to believe. Your vote is not selecting who will lead, but rather indicating which presentation of leadership you find most compelling. This information is valuable to those who designed the system, as it helps them refine their candidate selection and marketing for future cycles. More importantly, understanding this process helps immunize you against the emotional manipulation that drives modern politics. The manufactured outrage, the cultivated fear, the artificial divisions, all designed to keep the public arguing about personalities while policies remain consistent. By recognizing these techniques, you reclaim a measure of psychological sovereignty. The real power of the citizen in the modern era lies not in the voting booth, but in the ability to withdraw consent from the entire framework. While one person's withdrawal means little, collective recognition of these mechanisms could fundamentally alter how power operates. The system depends on maintaining the illusion of genuine choice and representative leadership. As this illusion weakens, so too does the system's efficiency. This is why understanding the 20-year presidential pipeline is so crucial. Not to promote hopelessness or disengagement, but rather to foster a more sophisticated form of citizenship, one that looks beyond the candidates presented to examine the structures that select them. Real change will not come from choosing between pre-selected options, but from questioning why our options are so consistently limited to candidates who emerge from the same networks, backed by the same interests, pursuing the same fundamental policies, regardless of their campaign promises. The next time you watch a presidential debate or see coverage of a rising star in politics, ask yourself, where did this person come from? Who supported their rise? What positions did they hold before entering public life? Which private organizations do they belong to? Which financial institutions fund their campaigns? The answers will often reveal the invisible primary that occurs decades before the public ever casts a vote. This knowledge doesn't make you powerless, it makes you clear-eyed, and clarity is the first requirement for any meaningful change. The system of pre-selected leadership has persisted for generations because it remains largely unrecognized by those it governs. By naming it, by understanding its mechanisms, we take the first step toward creating something more genuinely democratic. The eyes of power are watching, calculating, selecting the faces you'll see on your ballot years from now. But now, perhaps, you're watching back. And that awareness, multiplied across millions of citizens, is what the architects of this system fear most. If this video has opened your eyes, make sure to subscribe to Eyes of Power before the algorithm buries this content. Leave a comment with the word "selected" if you're awake to this reality. Remember, they don't fear your knowledge nearly as much as they fear your sharing of it. Until next time, keep your eyes open.